Yes, so I'm having a cold, and I'm hoping that my voice will be carrying all through this presentation, but I'll also try to mute if I need to cough or something. So who am I then? Yes, I'm an associate professor. I'm a computer scientist in my background, and I did my PhD in human-computer interaction. But since 2013, I have mainly been working with sustainability issues, both in my research and in my teaching. So I also teach sustainability topics here at KTH. And to situate me somewhere, I'm at the School of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at the Division of Media Technology and Interaction Design. And there I am co-leading a research group called MID4S, Media Technology and Interaction Design for Sustainability. And we are a research group that does research in the intersection of ICT and sustainability. And we're aiming for the transition of a more sustainable society and a good life within planetary boundaries. And so far, we've mostly been doing research in the areas of food, energy, transport, and cities, but it's rather wide what we're working with. We're also very interested in future studies, futuring, different ways of exploring what the future could be or how we could approach the future better. And then also we do then teach and also do research on our own teaching on how to integrate ICT and sustainability. Brilliant. Someone is not muted, but I'm not sure who. So if everyone could please mute, I would be very happy. Brilliant. So we're a research group there working with these issues. And when doing this kind of presentation, it's kind of hard to draw the lines of who you should include on a list of people who you're collaborating with. But I hope that I've covered most of the people who have been talking about these issues that I'm presenting in this presentation. And they are both at my research group, but also at other schools or at other universities. So if your name is not here and you still think that you've contributed to this, you're in my heart, that's for sure. Yes, and then let's come to the topic then. So today I'm presenting part of my research agenda or the things that I'm doing. And it has to do with digital behavior change intervention because we have a couple of projects focusing on this at KTH. And you might wonder, what do I mean by digital behavior change interventions? And there's many things that could fit within this definition. It could be eco-feedback, giving you information about your energy use or any other metrics that you have around some environmental impact. And whenever I'm going to use environmental impact in this presentation, it's going to be something that has a negative impact on the environment in any way. This is something I learned the hard way by collaborating with people who are more environmentally oriented than myself, because in the beginning when we were discussing impact, I was always positive, like that's brilliant, we're having an impact, because within my own field, impact usually means positive societal impact.
No, that I didn't do, so
and
work full time.
It doesn't always have to be then this positive kind of impact, but environmental impact is usually some kind of more negative impact on the environment. There's also the persuasive technologies, ways of trying to, without really making you super aware of it, change your behavior, where also nudging fits within this. So making it easy for you to do the right decision. This could, for example, be all the default settings that make sure that we don't use too much of streaming services or whatnot. And another word that often comes up when you're talking about digital behavior change interventions are gamification, of course, using game mechanism in other settings in order to make it more interesting or making you more engaged or doing stuff that you maybe weren't doing before, etc. In general, it's like this overall idea that you can have an app for that. So different ways that we can use digital technologies in order to make people change their behavior or somehow change either switching behavior or changing the behavior somewhat to more environmentally sustainable behavior. And the picture that you have on this slide is from an article by Yolanda Strengers called "Smart Energy in Everyday Life, Are You Designing for Resource Man?" And I think this, the criticism within my own field, human-computer interaction, especially when it comes to persuasive technologies, but I guess it has to do with all this idea that we can use a simple app to make people change their behavior, is that they are very often designed for a particular type of person, and we're not all the same. So I don't really myself see myself as this man standing here, like the superhero of understanding energy and knowing all about the numbers around my house and wanting to, at any given moment, be able to go and tweak on the settings on my electrical equipment in order to save energy. So this is a kind of an archetype of the kind of users that might be interested in these kind of gamifications app or eco feedback. Of course, this is an archetype, so there's many different personalities and people who might be interested in it, but I think it's important to remember that we're not all always looking at the numbers. Okay, so what kind of areas am I going to talk about in this presentation today? So I'm going to have an environmental impact perspective, and that means that, I mean, you can do behavior change interventions for many different reasons. But in this particular case, I'm looking at how can we make a smaller impact on the environment in any way. And I'm also going to focus on food, energy, mobility, and then slide over into the everyday practices. And there's a reason for that. And I guess that you could see behavior change interventions, digital or not, in many of these fields without them having to do with environmental impact. So for example, when it comes to food, there are many digital tools you could use for healthy reasons, for health and well-being reasons connected to food, etc. Or when it comes with mobility, there's tons of training apps or apps that should make sure that you start walking more or moving around more, etc. For your health. But what I'm looking at is then with the aim of trying to reduce the environmental impact. So let's go into business, to some research studies and some results. I'm going to start off with a systematic review that we did a few years back, and it was Björn Hedin who led this study, and so we wanted to understand what kind of behavior change interventions have been done, digital ones, regarding food consumption. So we're not looking at the agricultural sector, or we're not looking at the production of food or anything like that, but we're looking from the point where you would be consuming food. And we did it very systematically, following the Prisma protocol and you know, searching Green File, Scopus, and ACM Digital Library, which includes also the IEEE library. And we got 2,039 papers that was caught in our net through the search terms we were using, and then through looking through the title, the abstract, and then finally looking through the whole paper. We ended up with 5 included studies in the paper that we're analyzing. So that's a lot of paper that disappeared on the way, and I should say that not all of these papers are not necessarily bad, but they were not fulfilling our purpose of there having to be a empirical study where you could see some kind of change in individuals after using the digital behavior change intervention. And we were quite generous in what we deemed as a digital behavior change intervention. It could be any kind of intervention where some kind of ICT, information and communication technology, was used in the intervention package, you could say. Interestingly, most of the studies that we found were around food waste. And I should say that they were mostly done in the Western world, so Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic countries. Weird. There were only 2 papers that wouldn't be classified as that, and they were unfortunately not so well conducted, in the sense that there were theories missing, or there were missing a well-defined control group, or that they had done some kind of baseline measurements, etc. So it's really hard to draw any summarized findings from this study, except that we actually do need to have more research done on digital behavior change interventions, etc. And when we were doing this study, we were using a framework to analyze these papers. So we used the behavior change wheel and behavior change technology taxonomy to kind of break down the different interventions according to what kind of functionalities they were using in order to make people then change their behavior. I should also say that there's really a lot going on. So, I mean, there are many great ideas, both in the research papers, even though we don't really know if they will lead to any long-term change. And I should also say that that's one of the major issues with most of the studies found in this review, is that they don't have any longitudinal follow-up. So it might be a study that were during a week or a couple of weeks or up to even a month, but then they didn't have a follow-up after half a year or a year to see if these changes that they had seen during the study, if they were continuing after the intervention had stopped. And there's also quite a lot of different commercial examples that wasn't found in the research literature that are ongoing and happening right now, like Karma or Olio or Too Good To Go. And it would be really interesting to see what happens when these kind of technologies are used in everyday life. But I have an example of a digital behavior change technology that was actually implemented at KTH. So this is a study that Cecilia Katsev, Annika Karlsson-Kanyama, and Jorge Sapico has done here at KTH's campus. And they were interested to see whether or not it's possible to share food through a digital app. So they developed this app called Rädda Maten, or Save the Food. And they made a trial run of this at KTH campus before the pandemic, I should say. and some of the conclusions from the study was that you need a critical mass of users. So this is always the problem when you try to launch these kind of new technologies where, for example, sharing is needed, that you need a critical mass of users before it becomes interesting for more people to use the app. So it's kind of a hen or the egg situation. It was also clear that some people had, issues around food brings up other problems, in the sense that you might not want to only be the one who receives food, but you actually want to be a person who also gives away food. So only taking food would stop some of the uses. So that was also an issue that was raised, but they also saw that it was easier to share leftover food from catering rather than home cooked food. And it had to do with ideas of what is a proper meal, and how do we know that this meal has been well cooked, etc. And then one of the major challenges was actually that the place where someone would be able to leave food was in a office kitchen, and these are behind locked doors at KTH. So it would be hard for other people to come and collect the food since they didn't have maybe a key card to that particular office. So if this would be something that you wanted to scale up, it might be that you need to also change the infrastructure in the sense so that there would be special fridges or kitchens that you could go to where you could come easily access the fridge where the food was left for you. But still, I think it's an interesting study. And then just as a comment to this, fact that in the literature review, we only saw examples, or not only, I think all but two or something like that, were around food waste. So I think there's huge opportunities here to explore how we can use digital tools to reduce the environmental impact from the food system on the consumption side, but not looking only on food waste. Now, food waste is a huge problem, but there might be other things to do here. And one thing that is not really digital necessarily, but I think is an evocative idea, is that today we have these climate and energy advisors at municipality level, but what if we would have someone who would do advice on how to grow your own food, or what kind of food you could forage or find in a city setting. Yes, and there's also interesting examples of digital intervention, I would say, for example, Co-Grow, which is a sharing platform where you can advertise that you have a garden that you're not growing anything in, and you want to have people to come and grow food in your garden, or you can put up an ad that you're looking for a garden to grow food in. So it's a kind of a sharing initiative around places to grow your food. And most important, one thing I find very important when it comes to food is that it connects to so many other sustainability issues or things, in the sense that it so clearly connects to health and well-being, but also biodiversity, etc. So working with food is kind of interesting, since it has these clear connections to many of the other SDGs beyond, for example, climate impact. Brilliant. And unfortunately, this is going to be a cliffhanger for you, but we have gone through the very arduous process of doing another systematic literature review, looking at digital behavior change interventions, but within the field of energy. But it's still ongoing, so I can't really say more than some very, very tentative results from this. But I'm looking forward to see where there's areas of interest for doing more research. I should say that this is an area where research has been going on for much longer, I think. So it's not maybe surprising that we found many more studies. And of course, this is connected to the proliferation of smart meters and smart homes and things and data that you can get out of these sensing tools. What we can see from reading the paper so far is that a majority of the papers are on electricity, even though we have quite broadly looked at energy, but there are also papers on heating and water use, etc. And there's more studies outside of households in this literature review than in the literature review on food, where most of the studies were on households. And unfortunately, again, then, surprisingly few studies are longitudinal, so we don't really know about the changes over time and whether or not if there are savings done during the period of the intervention, if those savings are kept after a few months or something like that. Already today, I mean, most of us can get access to our own data when it comes to our own energy use, etc. So this is also maybe a field where it's easier to find data that you actually can use in digital behavior change interventions. And then I'm going to talk shortly about mobility. And here we haven't done a systematic literature review, but there is a plethora of ICT-based tools that you can use when it comes to mobility. For example, travel planners or mobility as a service, etc. And I want to just shortly mention, but not go deep into it, since it's not really a digital behavior change intervention. But there has been a project at Green Leap called A Car-Free Year, which I find really, really interesting. It was done a couple of years ago. And what they did in that project was to remove the car from 3 families within the Stockholm area and then follow them for 1 year. And instead they were using light electrical vehicles like box bikes or a Renault Twizy. And they were looking at what happened with these families and how they experienced this change, and what they needed, what kind of hinders and barriers and opportunities there were around this setting. And 1 year, that's like, now having done these literature reviews, that's a pretty long project. So that's amazing. If I'm going to say something from the car for a year and from other studies that I've both been involved in but also read about, it's really, really hard, especially when it comes to mobility, to separate kind of the mobility practices compared to from other practices, because mobility is so highly entwined with other things that we do in our life. So how we cook food, mobility comes in there, since we have to get the food to our homes, etc., etc. So now I'm shortly going to tell you about an intervention, or actually a set of interventions done at KTH that had to do with mobility. So this was done at Mr. Sams. And what they did in this study was that they were looking at the cost of mobility. So in one setting, they let people know the real cost of the car. So whenever they took a trip in a mobile app, they got to know how much that particular trip cost if you included all the fixed and semi-fixed costs around the car, and not only the fuel costs. And what happened was that the people who took part in the study, few of them knew the real cost of their car or the trip of the car. You kind of ignore it. So when you have bought your car, you store the the information about the fixed and semi-fixed costs somewhere, so you don't really think about them when you're driving your car. And the people who took part in the study, they had relatively old cars, so that made the costs relatively lower. I mean, if they had much newer cars, the cost of one trip would have been higher, since there's this the depreciation of the car is highest in the beginning of a car's life, rather than if you have an older car. And after the study, few of them could imagine having a car sharing scheme instead of owning their own car, partly because the difference in cost wasn't so big. But there's also other things coming in here. So it turns out that it's not maybe the everyday travels that is the reason why they have a car, but actually the trips for a vacation, or if they own a summer cottage or similar, that's when they really need a car. And those are longer trips. And then they own a car because of that. And then they use it when they already have the car. The other intervention they did was to try to see if they, through subsidizing tickets on the public transport, if they travel during off-peak hours, if that would make any change. And it turned out that few in the study did any changes at all. Maybe if a couple of them maybe changed a couple of trips, because, well, that was mainly because they were very close to the cheap ticket time, so they didn't actually change their practices so much around this. And then finally, they tried to reward bicycling. So if the respondents were bicycling to a place and then back again, so not only biking for the pleasure of it, they would get 1 krona per biked kilometer, up to a maximum level of 400 kronor per month. But none of the participants were motivated by this reward. However, they thought that maybe if the reward was higher, they would be motivated, or maybe others would be motivated by this reward. And I think this is interesting because it shows that it's kind of hard to change the mobility or the practices of our mobility, and that the monetary value of it is not always the thing that drives us really, but rather other things around this. I should also say that Mr. Sams run other interventions, which I find really, really interesting. So they also have a job hub in the suburb of Tullinge that I would thing that I think is really interesting, but it's not really a digital intervention. Or it is in a way, but not a digital behavior change intervention in the way I'm talking about it in this presentation. Brilliant. So coming then through from food and energy and mobility, and I mentioned practices as a way of looking at how we behave in the world, and where our environmental impact come from, and how hard it is to change some practices because they're bundled together. I would like to go over to a type of digital behavior change interventions that are looking at the whole life or the whole everyday life of a person. So one way of looking at your environmental impact is to use carbon footprint calculators, and they can be designed in many different ways. The one on the slide here is from WWF called Klimatkalkylatorn, which is perhaps one of the most easy to use. You answer a couple of questions and then you get an estimate of your carbon footprint for a year. There are other types of carbon calculators that can be more detailed in terms of how many questions they ask and what kind of questions they ask around your consumption. But there's also, for example, Svalna, which is a carbon calculator that takes financial data and make a estimation of your footprint from your financial data. So you connect it to your bank card, basically. They are, of course, then criticized by research, of course. They might be really good to give you a baseline, maybe give you knowledge that you didn't have before, or show you hotspots where you could change your impact. But research has also shown that they are, it's kind of hard to act on this kind of data. So you don't really know what you're supposed to do, or at least some users feel that they don't really know what's the next steps for me if I want to do anything about my environmental impact. And this follows in general this kind of knowledge action gap, that we might have knowledge about our environmental impact, but then we still continue to work or do like we did before, and not really changing this environmental impact. Yes, so what could be done then if you want to kind of develop on these carbon footprint calculators, since they are more all-encompassing and showing you impact from your whole life? And then I'm going to tell you about two of these tools that have taken the carbon calculator a step further. So this is a commercial system called Digster. It's a carbon footprint calculator, but they also have in the app a kind of knowledge journey where you can get to know more things about sustainability issues. There's challenges that you can do in order to lower impact. So they have defined actions that you can make, but they also have these habits. So that's like challenges that you have to do over a period of time and over again. And by doing that, they then become or form a new habit. So this app is available for private use, but their main business model is to sell it to companies and having kind of a step competition, but instead of taking steps to better your health, you actually engage in these challenges to lower your carbon footprint. And at our division, we've had a master student who were working together with Digster, and they were looking at push notifications. So whenever you're hearing about challenges, that could easily be reoriented into gamification or a game-like feature so that you could compete with others. So what Sebastian did in this master thesis was to look at push notification. He had push notifications that were competition oriented, so they were kind of implying that you were competing with someone else, or they were collaboration oriented, so they evoked thoughts about us doing something together, basically. And then there was also a control group that didn't get or receive any notifications. And the study found out that getting notifications increased engagement with the app compared to the control group, which maybe isn't so surprising. If you're reminded by the app, you're going to go into the app more often. But the only other statistically significant result was that men in the competition group logged in more frequently and did more habits deeds. So doing these repeated activities to form a new habit. So in this case, the competition-oriented notifications made men at least do more of these activities in the apps. And we have one more of these kind of tools. So another tool commercially developed is Habits. It's a web app. It also combines carbon footprint calculator with challenges. And again, it's the main business model is to sell this as a step competition to companies. And we currently have an ongoing research project collaboration with Habits. The project goes Habitwise, and it's Cecilia Katzev, who's the product manager of this project. And currently, for 1 week, we've had a campaign at Swedbank. So somewhere around 199 individuals at Swedbank is currently using the app, and they're going to do it for 8 weeks, and then we're going to of course evaluate what happened during these 8 weeks. And a little bit later in the spring, we're going to do a similar campaign at Göteborg Energi. It's going to be a smaller user group, but we're going to do the same kind of campaign and then also evaluate what happens when you do this in a organizational perspective. Is it can the kind of organization or the company help these users to address sustainability issues, and what do they think about it when they do it? They're very kind of engaged and enthusiastic of being part of this research, both Swedbank and Göteborg Energi, so it's going to be super interesting, and we will have results later in the autumn. But before we started these campaigns during the autumn, so I should say that we were supposed to start the campaigns last spring, so we're a bit late on that, but due to the corona pandemic, we've had to postpone it a bit, but now finally we are up and running. But during the autumn, we did an interview study, and it was Axel Björn Hansen who did the interviews. We were looking for people who had found the app by themselves. So I think both Digster and Habits it's possible to use it as a private person, but then you're not kind of part of this campaign and the packaging around the campaign. And these are some tentative results from that study. We've written a paper and submitted it, but so it's in that process right now. What was clear from this interview study was that the individuals who found the app by themselves, they are already deeply engaged in sustainability issues. Like you don't kind of stumble upon this tool by accident, but if you find it, you are already quite engaged in sustainability issues. And then maybe they are not the primary user group for this kind of app. So they were very enthusiastic about it, but they hadn't been using it for any prolonged time. And some of them were also, I'd say, far beyond the functionality of the app. They were keeping their own records in Excel sheets on very detailed emissions from the food they were eating and such. And the simple carbon calculator that were used in the app didn't really match this very engaged perspective that they had. Some of the people that we were interviewing, they were super motivated by gamification, but most of them were not. And even though it may be not very salient in the web app that it is a competition, it still has these gamified mechanism like leaderboards and statistics around who's currently doing most of the challenges, etc. So it's also interesting to see whether or not this matches the people who are using the app. Most of the respondents felt a lack of social context. And this is perhaps not surprising since they found this as a private user. and we think that this will be counteracted in the company campaign that we're following, since then you have the social context of being within an organization, and you can see the other teams and know who they are, or at least where they are in the organization, etc. But in the private use, you have these leaderboards, but you don't really know who the other people on the leaderboards are, so it doesn't motivate you particularly. And even though it's an extension then of the carbon footprint calculator, the added challenges are not really enough. So I think that there's something maybe missing here for at least this particular user group. So they felt that it was an interesting concept. Maybe other people would be interested in using this, but most of them had used it for a short while, and then the interest in it had waned. Yes, and I'm nearing the end of my presentation. So if you're sitting there and eagerly waiting to ask me questions, I'm soon there. So to summarize some of what I've been talking about today, when it comes to digital behavior change interventions, we should remember that competition isn't for everyone. So it's very easy to go to gamification. I think that that would be something that would engage people in looking at their own environmental impact. So then you have to think about what kind of other mechanism can be used and how would they be designed. So if we want to make people more engaged, how would we do that without necessarily using competition as the main driver? And the social is important. So how do you design for that? Not only so that you feel that you are in a social context, but perhaps also making change that isn't on an individual level. So most of the behavior change technologies I've been talking about today have been very geared towards individual behavior change. But what would it look like if we try to do this or make these tools that would work on group level? That's something also that I'm interested in exploring. And then there's this fact that many of these tools, they become like a transition tool, not only in that they help in the transition to a more sustainable society, but rather that they have a transitional meaning for the users. So using a carbon calculator, that might be a first step in understanding the hotspots or your environmental impact in general. And then you have to do something else to continue with changing your practices or making other adjustments to your life. And that might be okay. We might just have to be aware of that. But if we would like the use of these technologies to stretch over a longer period of time, how do we design for that? And probably we also have to work with personalization and making sure that they are adaptable to where people are in the change process that might take several years to go through. So how can we design for longer use? And then also very, very important, we have to think about how these digital interventions fit within a larger societal changes. So you might be super engaged and interested in changing your own practices or lessening the environmental impact from your life. But if the infrastructure around you, the urban fabric or whatnot, the food system is opposing you or making it hard for you to change, it doesn't matter how much digital behavior change intervention we throw on them. These other barriers will make sure that the changes doesn't come. So how do we cooperate over different fields to make sure that we can drive this change together, with or without digital behavior change interventions, basically? Yes. So actually, that was my presentation, and I am happy to open up for any questions from you, the listeners.